Superversive Livestream. I am your host, Benjamin Wheeler, and I'm here with my co host, Anthony Marquetta, and today we're talking about The Return. Anthony, how are you doing today? Good. I mean, good. Uh, yeah, so you went out and you saw The Return in theaters, and you have some opinions. Excellent. Thank you guys. Welcome. Next week we'll have. No, I'm kidding. All right, yeah, let's why was it ass, Anthony? Was it like a good ass or was it like a bad ass? And not like a cool badass, but like an ass that makes you feel sorrowful, you know, that such an ass would be. Hello, Bradford Walker. Yes. Right. Mm-hmm. Hmm. Uh, but yes, keep going. Stand by. I've upped your audio. All right. And you're up across the board. And you're up across the board, so we should be fine now. Absolutely. Yeah. And and the thing is with adaptions and you know how things evolve over time. Odysseus was a complete character in the Odyssey who was a major, well, secondary character in, no, major character in the Iliad. Oh yeah, yeah. And so it's like you know you already have a complete character, but for what we moderns desire, we often desire a character arc, and it's perfectly reasonable to have a character arc where a soldier becomes not just a soldier, but you know a ruthless. You know, able to, for example, kill 108 men and some traitorous maids, perhaps, maybe even spoilers. Hmm. Right, right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Law of hospitality. Mm-hmm. Mm. Mm. You are all the way up. Uh, excuse me, guys. All right, give it a shot now.
Bradford, let me know if you can hear me.
Looks like
Hmm.
one of the side pieces was muted. I've unmuted it. Sorry about that.
I see. Okay. So let me summarize the longer thing that I've been talking about, which is that the return takes out all of the mythic, and this has larger consequences for the story that you might not have
Right.
anticipated. Uh, One of the consequences is why exactly was Odysseus away from home? Now, I am a proponent, and I am, or at least willing to entertain the theory that Odysseus is lying about the extent of things that happened. Nevertheless, Odysseus himself is presenting what is keeping him from home as a series of essentially supernatural disasters, right? Um, or of God, gods and mythical things that are keeping him from coming home. He wants to come home. It's a very important theme of the story is that the homecoming desperately wants to come home. He's stuck on Calypso's island looking out towards the sea, weeping bitterly in depression, right? Because he wants to get home. He does everything in his power to get home, but he can't get home, right? So when he gets home, there is no angst here. He has very badly wanted to get home. There's no guilt, right? He's tried. You know, he just couldn't do it. But when you strip out the mythic, why isn't Odysseus home, right? Like, that raises the question what kept him? It's not even that Odysseus is lying. It's that they're not even bringing up this idea of, meeting with witches and cyclops and monsters as a possibility, right? It's not even an option. So, if that is the case, then you are left with he just mysteriously wasn't home for 20 years. And then so you get why Odysseus doesn't really want to do anything when he gets to Ithaca because he's like guilt ridden. They give him this sort of like modern PTSD. Now, Odysseus did not really have PTSD.
Mm.
Odysseus, that's not to say that the war didn't affect Odysseus. It absolutely did, even in the Odyssey, right?
Right.
Like we get the famous scene, which is one of my my favorite scenes in the Odyssey, when he hears them telling the story of the Trojan horse and he cries, right? Like Odysseus is definitely affected by his time in Troy, but he's not affected to the he doesn't feel guilty over it, right?
Mm.
Like he's not bothered by it.
I think.
He's moved by it, but he's not bothered by it. You know,
Yeah.
not he doesn't look back at his time in Troy and go, "Wow, I did, I was horrible." Right?
Yeah.
No, that's not it.
I
Uh,
think I think there's a difference that we should treat like quote unquote ancient PTSD with like our time of PTSD. Like soldiers, some people I've talked to have nightmares about jumping on a grenade and then being having to piece together, or they had to run over a kid because they were under mortar fire or something like that. Like that's not the same as being shoulder to shoulder with your brothers fighting desperately at the seat of an enemy castle. Not that I'm saying that there
yeah,
wouldn't
one
be
thing
an
that people have
effect,
talked
but
about too. So,
it's
one
different.
thing, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to finish up and say that it's just a different type of war. Where if you do it with your own hands, it's fundamentally different than seeing somebody's head explode from 150 yards.
Yeah, and this is the reason, by the way, even back then, that they had like a love-hate relationship with the bow and arrow, right?
Mm,
Uh, Archers were considered cowardly, but they also saved your men. So if they were very effective, it could be very helpful, which is why Odysseus is an archer and Paris is an archer, right?
yes.
But Odysseus isn't only an archer, which is another key. But yeah, like there's another point too that somebody pointed out that Homer's portrayal of warfare in the Iliad is actually many people throughout history have pointed out that his portrayal of battleship wounds or battlefield wounds is very
Mm,
accurate. Uh, but it's more than that. It's like, oh well, you have these heroes who are killing, dozens of men and are at the forefront of the battle. This is less inaccurate than you think, because these would have been the men with the good armor, right?
right.
Like they were, and they were also the men who you wanted to survive because they were the leaders. So they would get the good armor, and yes, they would fight at the forefront of the battles, and yes, they would, participate. But nevertheless, it was harder to kill them, right? And this becomes a big deal later when Achilles is gifted armor. He won't even go out without the armor. Uh, but other men would have to go out without armor, right? People below the rank of the kings and the
Yes.
heroes would have to go out without armor. So it's surprisingly accurate in ways people didn't necessarily think of, I think, or modern people don't necessarily think of.
Right.
But either way, when you get to the point when Odysseus returns home in the Odyssey, he does not have any regrets about what he did in Troy. That's not to say like it didn't affect him. Like I said, it absolutely moves him, right, when he thinks back on what happened. We see this explicitly, in a very touching scene. But it does not he's not guilt-ridden over it, right? That's not what we see in the return. Odysseus is so guilt-ridden, he can't even bring himself to rid the palace of the suitors. And everybody is criticizing him for this. When the swineherd whose name I can't pronounce, Eudaimon or something, Eurimian or something, when he figures it out, he's angry at him. And then there's a scene that's particularly awkward. Telemachus is insufferable in the return. It's very annoying. He's constantly kind of bitchy and pissy, especially towards his mother. He wants her to pick a suitor. He doesn't believe Odysseus is ever. He believes Odysseus is dead, and he doesn't actually do anything himself, though. In fact, Odysseus even calls him out on this at one point in the movie, in one of my least favorite scenes. Telemachus has went out searching for Odysseus earlier in the movie. He comes back and says, I met a sailor who said that Odysseus was trapped, was on an island with some woman for 7 years. Right? Now, this is clearly an allusion to Calypso. But remember, in the return, there is no supernatural element. So what you're meant to get out of this is that he tried to run off with a woman, then changed his mind. Right?
Yep.
Uh, At the very least, that's what Telemachus believes, and Odysseus never disabuses him of this, right? So, my sister, who watched it with me, pointed out that the sailor in the Odyssey would never even have known about this, because how would he have known about Calypso? But then I pointed out that he could have heard it from Odysseus afterward, but that's neither here nor there. Anyway, when Telemachus meets Odysseus after he returns to the island and learns that it's him, he actually tries to fight him. He's like angry that Odysseus is there. He's like, what were you doing? You waited, now the island is in shambles and you're doing nothing, right? It's awful because, like, you're watching this going, Odysseus, defend yourself, right? Like, say something. I tried to get home, but I couldn't. I'm very sorry. He even has a line where he goes, Odysseus never would have returned home without his men. That's how I know it can't really be you. Which is like, again, I'm going like, Odysseus, defend yourself. Go, look, listen, I understand, but I tried to get them all home. I tried so hard, son. You have no idea.
I angered Zeus of Poseidon. I'm sorry.
Right.
Ticked off the gods.
Well, yeah. Meanwhile, Odysseus responds correctly to Telemachus, hold on, you're blaming me for the state of the island? Weren't you supposed to be my steward while I was gone? He's like, what have you done? And I'm like, yeah, actually, that's a really good point, considering Telemachus's attitude, right?
Yes.
And Telemachus responds with, I know everybody on this island's names. How dare you? And I'm immediately like, bro, who cares?
They're slaves.
Why does it's not that? It's why does that matter? You just admitted the island was in shambles. It might be in shambles, but I know all of their names. Yeah, and then 250 gets you a cup of coffee. But Odysseus has no response to this. And then later, he meets Penelope, and there is a scene where it's heavily implied. I have literally, by the way, never seen an adaptation of the Odyssey or an interpretation of the Odyssey that doesn't assume that Penelope knows who Odysseus is, which is really funny because I think it's pretty clear in the text that she absolutely does not know that it's him. Like, I know people go like, oh, well, she would recognize him, but it was literally a disguise created by a goddess.
Right.
Like, she didn't recognize him. It's pretty clear. But anyway, she clearly recognizes him. And she's, like, excoriating him for basically not doing something about it, right? And then she just acts like he didn't show up until the very end when she gives him the arrow. He shoots through the axes. He kills all the suitors. And Telemachus is there. Telemachus kind of like, oh, he's finally doing something, and he joins him. But then Penelope runs out at the end of it when they're about to kill Antinous, who, by the way, in the Odyssey, he is killed first, but in this one, they save for last. For literally no reason except to give him a line.
Probably.
And Penelope yells, no, don't. And Telemachus pauses before killing him, and Antinous tries to say something. And then Telemachus kills him anyway, while Penelope screams. And I'm like, first off, thank you for actually killing him anyway. He absolutely had to die. Right?
Yes.
And second, what on earth is Penelope upset about? Like, legitimately, I know this sounds weird, but like, even nowadays, I would say that such a person was ungrateful, but she was begging, praying for Odysseus's return, holding off, doing that thing where she was unthreading her loom every night, right? Yes. And when he finally returns and does what else was he supposed to do? What did she think would happen, right? Like, and the maid correctly says this to her. She goes like, no, that was that was a slaughter. And then the maid's like, yeah, he had to do it. What were you expecting? Like, you wanted him to come back, didn't you? Like, why would she not want Antinous killed? The dude was horrible, right?
Yes.
I will say I really didn't mind the portrayal of Antinous. It was interesting. They made him almost like a Iago type, or like he was he was like a schmoozer type guy more than the sort of thug character that we get in Epic the Musical. But it wasn't a bad portrayal, so like there's one nice thing to say. But just to give you an idea, like why I so significantly dislike this, she has a line where she says to Odysseus, like, why do men go to war? Which kind of gets you at the heart of my issue with this version of the Return, which is it seems to agree or at least be very sympathetic to Penelope's perspective, but I don't think her perspective is a realistic one for the time period, right? Like, her anger at Odysseus slaughtering all the suitors is a good example here, where, like, Penelope in the original is not angry about this. She's happy about this, right? The
Right.
suitors were awful. They had to die, right? In a sense, it's a very feminine reaction. It's a womanly reaction to men's work, right?
Yes.
And it's a womanly reaction that fundamentally does not understand the necessity and importance of men's work. She asks Odysseus when she acting is like, oh, you were in Troy, you fought with my husband. He's like, they would rape and murder. And then he says, did you rape? And Odysseus just kind of hangs his head in shame. Now, I think, in my opinion, my sister and I disagreed on this. I think it's ambiguous if it's implying that Odysseus actually raped someone. I don't think it is. I think it's more like he's just so ashamed of his actions, he can't bring himself to defend himself. You know what I mean? I don't think it necessarily means he actually raped someone, but nevertheless, the fact that Odysseus is ashamed of his actions is kind of wrong. Like, you wouldn't take that from a woman, frankly.
Yep.
Specifically not your wife, right, who is yelling at you. Now, you might take it if it were really a beggar who was really addressing the queen, you might take it, but not the king Odysseus talking to his wife, right?
Right.
That perspective is simply not true, which the maid suggests. And then Telemachus literally goes off at the end of the movie and says, I'm going to leave and go and, like, find myself. It's bizarre. It's like, that's not something that you do in this time period.
Well,
right?
I mean, they would, except it's more like find myself by raping and pillaging most of Italy, or something like that, uh, in a very active sort of sense, not shall we say, I'm just gonna hang out and smoke weed in Bucharest or something stupid like that. It wasn't like that. Like, it was, you get your friends together, you're stifled by your father's power, and now you're going to rape and pillage Sicily in grand old
The
tradition.
thing is, though, like, it's very out of character for Telemachus as well, because Telemachus is
Oh, I
somebody
agree.
who is. One of the problems is, my sister pointed this out, when you remove the mythic, the thing that pushes Telemachus's character arc is Athena,
Yes.
right? Athena pushes his arc, both as the goddess and in disguise, as mentor, right?
Yes.
And Telemachus develops. He grows into more of a kingly person, somebody who is a worthy heir to the throne of his father, right? Great. So, considering that, I'm trying to think of how to put this exactly. It's kind of difficult. Yeah, like, there is no Athena in this, which means Telemachus never really develops into a better person. That's the thing. In the Odyssey, if Telemachus had seen Odysseus and had responded with something along the lines of, like, how dare you abandon me, Odysseus probably wouldn't have stood for it, and he probably would have called Telemachus out. But that's not how Telemachus responds. At the beginning of the story, he wasn't the sort of person who could take on the suitors. Now that he's at the end of the story, he is ready, or is almost ready, to take them on, and now he has a good ally to help him in his father, and he's very willing to work together with him to do this, right? This is a very significantly different character than the Telemachus who blames Odysseus for not doing anything, but also doesn't do anything. Like, I don't know what he's angry about. Like, he keeps saying, like, why don't you do something? Why don't you clear the hot palace of the suitors? And I'm like, Telemachus, why don't you? And if your answer is I can't, why on earth do you think this old man can? Like, what does he have that you don't have? Of course, the answer to this question in the Odyssey is quite simple. It's that he has the aid of Athena and Zeus, and he has the rightful claim to the throne. But Telemachus clearly doesn't really care about this in the Return. So it doesn't really work for his character. He comes across as very unlikable, as does Penelope for not appreciating what Odysseus does. So you mentioned that you wanted to do this to get the idea here too. When Telemachus meets Odysseus in the original Odyssey, the meeting goes very, very, very differently. It's actually one of the most moving scenes in the Odyssey. Uh, so I am reading the Stanley. I'm going to be looking at the Stanley Lombardo translation of the Odyssey, which is my personal favorite version of the Odyssey. Odysseus is in the hut of his servant, the swineherd, who is like the good servant. And Athena has just told him he's in disguise as an old man. Athena has just told him it's time for you to reveal yourself to Telemachus. And she touches him with her magic wand, and his clothes change and his appearance changes, and he looks like Odysseus again. You know, his jawline firm, his beard glossy black, taller and younger, his skin is tanned. He has a fresh tunic and cloak. So, this is the line. Odysseus walks back into the swineherd's hut, where his son is waiting, right? Telemachus is there. And this is what the text of the original Odyssey says in the Lombardo translation. His son was astounded, shaken and flustered. He turned away his eyes for fear it was a god, and words fell from his lips in nervous flurries. You look different, stranger, than you did before, and your clothes are different, and your complexion. You must be a god, one of the immortals who hold high heaven. Be gracious to us so we can offer you acceptable sacrifice, and finely wrought gold, and spare us, please. And godlike Odysseus, who had borne much. I am no god. Why liken me to the deathless ones? No, I am your father, on whose account you have suffered many pains, and endured the violence of men. Saying this, he kissed his son and let his tears fall to the ground. He had held them in until now. So I want to pause here and note that Odysseus's reaction, even though it is in the context of the ancient world, is not inhuman, right? He cries when he tells Telemachus this. And more than that, he does take some responsibility for the issues that have befallen Telemachus, right? He says, on whose account you have suffered many pains, right? So Odysseus isn't entirely like guilt-free, but there is a difference from being guilt-free and being crippled by guilt, right? He's not so crippled by guilt that he can't act. And Telemachus responds to this. Yeah, that's very important. But Telemachus could not believe that this was his father, and he blurted out, "You cannot be my father, Odysseus. You must be some spirit enchanting me, only to increase my grief and pain later. No mortal man could figure out how to do this all on his own. Only a god could so easily transform someone from old to young. A while ago, you were old and shabbily dressed, and now you are like the gods who hold high heaven." And Odysseus, from his mind's teeming depths, "Telemachus, it does not become you to be so amazed that your father is here in this house. You can be sure that no other Odysseus will ever come, but I am here, just as you see, home at last, after 20 years of suffering and wandering." I also want to note here that I find Telemachus' response also extremely moving. Like, he sees Odysseus and then he's like, "No, like this is some sort of trick. It can't be." Right? Like, I think that's a very human response as well. So you will know this is Athena's doing. She can make me look like whatever she wants, a beggar sometimes, and sometimes a young man wearing fine clothes. It's easy for the gods to glorify a man or to make him look poor. He spoke and sat down, and Telemachus threw his arms around his wonderful father and wept. And a longing arose in both of them to weep and lament, and their shrill cries crowded the air, like the cries of birds, sea eagles, or taloned vultures, whose young chicks rough farmers have stolen out of their nest before they were fledged. Their tears were that piteous. So, first off, I want to say, like, number one, that is an incredibly deep metaphor. I actually really like it. Uh, that their cries were like the cries of young birds, whose young chicks rough farmers have stolen out of their nests before they were fledged. Like Telemachus is the young bird who was forced to go out on his own before he was truly ready because his father had to leave so early. I really like the metaphor. Uh, but note how Telemachus reacts to this. When Telemachus is finally, his mind is able to accept that it's really Odysseus, right?
Mm-hmm.
Telemachus throws his arms around his father and weeps, right?
Yes.
Uh, it's really like it's an extremely touching scene. Telemachus's reaction has always struck me as so human, right? Like that the first thing he
Yes.
does is go, "No, there's no way. It can't be you." And then Odysseus convinces him and then he breaks down, right? And
Yes.
even the way he describes it, a longing arose in both of them to weep and lament. Like, yes, this is a happy moment, but both of them are also like they're they do need to lament the lost years. But there's no anger here, right? Like
Yes.
nobody is angry. Odysseus isn't angry. Telemachus isn't angry. They're sad, over the lost years. They're happy that they can finally unite for the first time, but they're not angry.
Yes. There's the image of the birds itself, you could see it, as if they acted like a man, where birds, when they meet each other again after a long period of time, excuse me, they flutter their wings, they wrap their necks around each other and almost preen themselves with their beaks, as they get the feel of each other in what accounts for birds as a hug. You could almost see it, them hugging each other, with their heads over their shoulders, sort of looking at each other, feeling each other, getting the measure of each other in a way that, was not, something they could have done for these past 20 years. The metaphor itself is a good metaphor because there's no non-awkward way of describing the grief of meeting somebody you've missed for a very long time. I imagine a lot of heaven, when you enter into heaven, there's such things. When you meet, your relatives once again.
Yeah, I agree. It's a beautiful metaphor. It's a beautiful line.
Beautiful.
Uh, it's really great stuff. Like that whole scene in the Odyssey. It's one of my favorites in the entire work. And it was so disappointing to me to look at that moment in the movie and just see Telemachus being like, you can't be him. Odysseus is dead. It's like, where's the love, right?
Yes.
Like, where's the grief? Where's the longing, the all of this? It's all just gone and replaced with shallow anger,
Yes.
right?
And it doesn't even
So,
mean
yeah,
anything
go
or
ahead.
lead. It doesn't mean anything or lead to anything. Like, what does this add for their character arcs, their ideas? No, like in the end, this is sort of like, I know the return is starting from the end, but this is the fulfillment of their character arc, where they're together, and now all that remains is to deal with um, the suitors and such, and set the kingdom to rights, as any good king story ends.
Yeah, and of course there is one other moment that is very important to include, which this is another thing that was extreme. I was like very disappointed this wasn't in the story because this is a very, very famous moment from the Odyssey, right? Which I think you know where I'm going with this. Uh, the meeting between Odysseus and Penelope.
Mm. Yes.
So Penelope says that she needs to test this man to make sure that it's really Odysseus. So Odysseus leaves his bath. He bathes after he kills all the suitors, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it says, so Athena herself made his head and shoulders shimmer with grace. He came from the bath like a god and sat down on the chair again, opposite his wife, and spoke to her and said, "You're a mysterious woman. The gods have given to you more than to any other woman an unyielding heart. No other woman would be able to endure standing off from her husband, come back after 20 hard years to his country and home. Nurse, make up a bed for me so I can lie down alone, since her heart is a cold lump of iron. So Odysseus is like, why aren't you reacting more? Right? Like, he's like, something is up. But Penelope, as they says, and Penelope, cautious and wary, who is a match for Odysseus, says, "You're a mysterious man. I am not being proud or scornful, nor am I bewildered, not at all. I know very well what you looked like when you left Ithaca on your long-oared ship. Nurse, bring the bed out from the master bedroom, the bedstead he made himself, and spread it for him with fleece and blankets and silky coverlets." So, there's actually some wordplay going on here if you're being careful. She calls her, Odysseus calls Penelope a mysterious woman because he's saying that she's not reacting the way that a good wife should react. And Penelope, in response, says, yeah, well, you're a mysterious man. But she doesn't mean you're mysterious in the way you're acting. She means, I'm not even 100% sure it's really you. Right?
Mm.
So there's some clever wordplay going on, which fits, befits Penelope, right? And Odysseus. And then she tells her nurse to bring out the bed from the master bedroom to test it. And it says she was testing her husband. Odysseus could bear no more, and he cried out to his wife, "By God, woman, now you've cut deep. Who moved my bed? It would be hard for anyone, no matter how skilled, to move it. A god could come down and move it easily, but not a man alive, however young and strong, could ever pry it up. There's something telling about how the bed's built, and no one else built it but me. There was an olive tree growing on the site, long-leaved and full, its trunk thick as a post. I built my bedroom around that tree, and when I had finished the masonry walls and done the roofing and set in the jointed, close-fitting doors, I lopped off all the olive tree's branches, trimmed the trunk from the root on up, and rounded it and trued it with an adze until I had myself a bedpost. For the record, Odysseus, this is really dumb because the tree is going to continue growing and your bedpost will just get bigger and your room will just get smaller, but I'm going to continue. I bored it with an auger, and starting from this, I framed up the whole bed, inlaying it with gold and silver and ivory, and stretching across it oxide thongs dyed purple. So there's our secret. But I do not know, woman, whether my bed is still firmly in place, or if some other man has cut through the olive's trunk. At this, Penelope finally let go. Odysseus had shown he knew their old secret. In tears, she ran straight to him, threw her arms around him, kissed his face, and said, "Don't be angry with me, Odysseus. You of all men know how the world goes. It is the gods who gave us sorrow, the gods who begrudged us a life together, enjoying our youth and arriving side by side to the threshold of old age. Don't hold it against me that when I first saw you I didn't welcome you as I do now. My heart has been cold with fear that an impostor would come and deceive me. There are many who scheme for ill-gotten gains. Not even Helen, daughter of Zeus, would have slept with a foreigner had she known the Greeks would go to war to bring her home. It was a god who drove her to that dreadful act, or she never would have thought of doing what she did, the horror that brought suffering to us as well. But now, since you have confirmed the secret of our marriage bed, which no one has ever seen, only you and I and a single servant, Actor's daughter, whom my father gave me before I ever came here, and who kept the doors of our bridal chamber, you have persuaded even my stubborn heart." This brought tears from deep within him, and as he wept he clung to his beloved wife. Land is a welcome sight to men swimming for their lives after Poseidon has smashed their ship in heavy seas. Only a few of them escape and make it to shore. They come out of the gray water crusted with brine, glad to be alive and set foot on dry land. So welcome a sight was her husband to her. So that's a really, once again, like an incredibly beautiful section of writing with a really brilliant metaphor at the end of it. A metaphor that, in a sense, touches on the entire message of the Odyssey, right? The metaphor kind of is the Odyssey in a nutshell. And it shows, like, the gravity of this moment is like men who have been literally shipwrecked and lost at sea for years, who see land for the first time and are just glad to be alive. That's like how much this meeting means to Odysseus and Penelope. Like there's no there's nothing here about Penelope being like, oh, you're actually, you just turned my palace into a slaughterhouse. It's ridiculous.
Right.
Um, so I'm trying to go back to see like what happens immediately after the suitors are killed. See if there's anything that Penelope says. Doo-doo-doo. Honestly, there's so many good moments in like this end part of the Odyssey. There's even Euryclea the good maid, right? She's the old maid who recognizes Odysseus, who is actually one of the best characters in the Return because again, she's very accurate. She correctly tells Penelope, basically stop your crying. He had to do it, right? Uh, and it says the old nurse went through Odysseus's beautiful house, telling the women the news. They came from their hall with torches in their hands and thronged around Odysseus and embraced him. And as they kissed his head and shoulders and hands, he felt a sudden sweet urge to weep, for in his heart he knew them all. Which is another beautiful line, right? Like that Odysseus, after 20 years gone, still remembers the female servants of his household, right? And they
Mm-hmm.
still remember him and love him. Uh, which is another way of showing that Odysseus was a good king, right? He was a good king who knew that, who respected and loved Odysseus, and Odysseus is a good king because he remembers his servants. So Telemachus, to be fair here to the Return, I guess he's not entirely wrong about knowing their names. What he's wrong about is acting as if that matters when they're all suffering. Like that, there are priorities here.
Mm. Vengeance.
So I'm looking for the end of the fight with the suitors.
Mm.
So yeah, Odysseus too had his eyes wide open, looking all through his house to see if anyone was still alive and hiding from death. But everyone he saw lay in the blood and dust, the whole lot of them. And there's a metaphor. I'm going to skip it this time. The suitors are all dead, is the metaphor. Then Odysseus called to Telemachus, go call the nurse Euryclea for me. I want to tell her something. So Telemachus went to Euryclea's room, rattled the door, and called, get up and come out here, old woman. You are in charge of all our women servants. Come on. My father has something to say to you. Euryclea's response died on her lips. She opened the doors to the great hall, came out, and followed Telemachus to where Odysseus, spattered with blood and grime, stood among the bodies of the slain. A lion that has just fed upon an ox in a field has his chest and cheeks smeared with blood, and his face is terrible to look upon. So too Odysseus, smeared with gore from head to foot. When Euryclea saw all the corpses in the pools of blood, she lifted her head to cry out in triumph. But Odysseus stopped her cold, reining her in with these words. Rejoice in your heart, but do not cry aloud. It is unholy to gloat over the slain. These men have been destroyed by divine destiny and their own recklessness. They honored no one, rich or poor, high or low, who came to them. And so by their folly they have brought upon themselves an ugly fate. Now tell me, which of the women dishonor me, and which are innocent? So this is when Odysseus learns who the women were who slept with the suitors. So, for the record, Margaret Atwood has a book called The Penelopiad, where she refers to these maids who slept with the suitors as women who were raped. This is ludicrous. It's not in the Odyssey. Yes, there is a power imbalance, obviously, between the maids and the suitors, but the entire point here is that Euryclea is saying that they did not have to do it. They are absolutely at fault for sleeping with the suitors. Basically,
Mm-hmm.
they bet on the wrong horses, right?
Yes.
They decided to side with the suitors instead of with the household of Odysseus, and now they're going to be punished for it.
It's like
They were not raped.
the so like I'm using modern terms, but it's like how pickup artists view women with it's like, oh yeah, they're just going for mindlessly going for the next male who has more power, more influence, whatever. And it's like, yeah, okay, so they acted in the way that a pickup artist would act. They chose the strong horse in the moment. Um, and they chose it of their own free will. Because, frankly, it's like, how do I want to put it? If the suitors were going to rape anybody, they were going to rape Penelope. If you get me.
Yes, exactly. Uh, and by the way, I found the section I was really looking for, which is Penelope's response. So Euryclea tells Penelope what happens, and this is how Penelope responds to it. So, dear nurse, the gods have driven you crazy. The gods can make even the wise mad, just as they often make the foolish wise. So they have wrecked your usually sound mind. Why do you mock me and my sorrowful heart, waking me from sleep to tell me this nonsense? Uh, she has just said, by the way, that Odysseus has come home after all this time and has killed those men who tried to marry you. So she knows they're all been murdered, right? Like, this is not news to her. Uh, or, like, it is news to her here, but what I mean is, like, it's not that she thinks, oh, Odysseus is just back. She knows that the suitors have been killed, right? Why
Hmm.
do you mock me and my sorrowful heart, waking me from sleep to tell me this nonsense? And such a sweet sleep. It sealed my eyelids. I haven't slept like that since the day Odysseus left for Ilion, that accursed city. Now go back down to the hall. If any of the others had told me this and wakened me from sleep, I would have sent her back with something to be sorry about. You can thank your old age for this at least. And Euryclea, the loyal nurse. I am not mocking you, child. Odysseus really is here. He's come home just as I say. He's the stranger they all insulted in the great hall. Telemachus had known all along who had the self-control to hide his father's plans until he could pay the arrogant bastards back. Penelope felt a sudden pang of joy. She leapt from her bed and flung her arms around the old woman, and with tears in her eyes she said to her, Dear nurse, if it is true, if he really has come back to his house, tell me how he laid his hands on the shameless suitors, one man against all of that mob. Hold on, I lost the spot. Do. There we go. I didn't see and didn't ask. I only heard the groaning of men being killed. We women sat in the far corner of our quarters, trembling, with the good solid doors bolted shut, until your son came from the hall to call me, Telemachus. His father had sent him to call me, and there he was, Odysseus, standing in a sea of dead bodies, all piled on top of each other on the hard-packed floor. It would have warmed your heart to see him, spattered with blood and filth like a lion. And now the bodies are all gathered together at the gates, and he is purifying the house with sulphur, and has built a great fire, and has sent me to call you. Come with me now, so that both your hearts can be happy again. You have suffered so much, but now your long desire has been fulfilled. He has come himself, alive, to his own hearth, and has found you and his son in the hall. As for the suitors who did him wrong, he's taken his revenge on every last man. And Penelope, ever cautious, Dear nurse, don't gloat over them yet. You know how welcome the sight of him would be to us all, and especially to me and to the son he and I bore. But the story can't be true, not the way you tell it. One of the immortals must have killed the suitors, angry at their arrogance and evil deeds. They respected no man, good or bad, so their blind folly has killed them. But Odysseus is lost, lost to us here and gone forever. And Euryclea, the faithful nurse. Child, how can you say this? Your husband is here at his own fireside, and yet you are sure he will never come home? Always on guard, but here's something else clear proof. The scar he got from the tusk of that boar. I noticed it when I was washing his feet, and I wanted to tell you, but he shrewdly clamped his hand on my mouth and wouldn't let me speak. Just come with me, and I will stake my life on it. If I am lying, you can torture me to death. Still wary, Penelope replied, Dear nurse, it is hard for you to comprehend the ways of the eternal gods, wise as you are. Still, let us go to my son, so that I may see the suitors dead and the man who killed them. And Penelope descended the stairs, her heart in turmoil. Should she hold back and question her husband, or should she go up to him, embrace him, and kiss his hands and head? But yeah, and then you're getting to the scene where Penelope meets her. But you see how Penelope reacts to the death of the suitors. Now Euryclea expects her to react. Both Odysseus, Euryclea, and Penelope are all agreed. The suitors respected no man. They, because of their lack of respect, they deserve to die. In fact, they were so disrespectful, Penelope considers it plausible that the gods would just end them. Right? And certainly, she is by no means disappointed to hear that Odysseus has killed them all. In fact, What she is worried about is not that Odysseus slaughtered everyone. What worries her is whether or not it really is Odysseus. Euryclea even brags about how he's standing in a sea of bodies. And Penelope's heart gets a pang of joy when she learns about this.
It's moving.
Yeah, it's moving. It's also something that the return gets completely wrong, right? But it gets it wrong because it's thinking of it like a modern and not in a good way, right? Like, it comes at it from this attitude of, slaughter and bloodshed is inherently evil. I mean, it's not inherently evil when you're killing those who justly deserve to die, right? To
Yep.
protect your house and home, to free your kingdom from the tyranny of strangers, right?
Yes.
Uh,
It,
yeah,
it, hmm. It's
it bothers me. Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, no, it's worth being bothered over by how they treat her, because there's something fundamental to the character of Penelope that is missed out on. You can't just live a quote unquote soft life and have the pressures that she had hanging over your head like a literal 108 swords of Damocles. That requires a certain iron will and strength of character. Like various other characters clearly couldn't measure up to the pressure, though, like those maids, and they probably had servants and stuff that helped them. If one of them's the good servant, there must be bad servants, and I'm sure that Odysseus put paid to them too. But what am I thinking of? But if you're writing characters and you want to adapt them, if you want an emotional moment, like there's play and things like I don't believe you. Why in the world, he must be a god in disguise, etc. Or um, I don't believe you. I think this is just one of the suitors who have killed the rest and you're having an episode. Like you have ways where Penelope can have a negative reaction to the news that these suitors are dead and Odysseus has come back. You talk too much. That's just Telemachus, and he slew the suitor. Like you have tons of options about how to do it, but how Anthony is about to describe her reaction just is not the way to do it while maintaining the ironclad discipline of Penelope's character.
Right. Like, what you see in that scene between her and Odysseus is that she's intentionally disappointing Odysseus a bit there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I've seen people say, "Oh, like again, I actually don't agree with interpretations that she knew it was Odysseus all along. I don't think that fits the evidence
Right.
that we see in the text.
That you've
I
just
think
read.
it's very clear that the disguise was created by Athena. It was a
Excuse
supernatural
me.
disguise. So it is very plausible it could have fooled her after 20 years away. And after that, even when she recognized him, she's being very careful because, again, it's been 20 years. So she tests him, right? Like, pretty clear to me uh, what's going on here, personally, right?
Mm-hmm.
And all of this is to say, I'm trying to think of exactly how to put it. Yeah, all of this is to say that I actually find the way. This is one thing that I really appreciated when I read Homer for the first time, like over the past year, which is that his reactions always strike me as very human, right?
Yes.
Uh, Penelope's reaction is actually quite human, right? Like,
Yep.
it is not. It doesn't come across as force, right? Penelope learns about this, and her immediate thought is, no way, it's some sort of trick. You're going insane, right? It can't be. And then when she sees him, she can't bring herself to fully hope immediately. She's worried, like, that the gods are tricking her, right? Because she blames the gods for what happened. It's really funny. They blame the gods pretty regularly in the
Hmm.
Odyssey, and it opens up with Zeus like bitching about how mortals just can blame the gods for everything when it's mostly mortals' fault, uh, which is kind of funny.
Yes.
But anyway, Penelope is blaming the gods for all this. She's like, "Look, I think she says like, even Helen wouldn't have done something so stupid if the gods hadn't made her," which is a really funny way of putting it.
Right.
Um,
And it's like, no, I don't agree, Penelope.
and it's like, I don't know, Helen's pretty stupid, Penelope. I think you underestimate just how stupid Helen is. Uh, although she's not entirely wrong, because it is the gods that like engineered it, but whatever. Uh, so there's she's right and wrong. But the point being that like she can't bring herself in the moment to fully trust it. She has to test him, and only when she passes the test to her satisfaction is Penelope able to break down,
Mm.
right? Like and have an emotional reaction. And Odysseus, when he realizes, oh, it was just a test, right? That's the other thing too. The beauty of the moment is that the godlike Odysseus, the man of twists and turns, is tricked by Penelope, right?
Yep.
Um, who he has been tricking all along, but Penelope manages in this moment to trick him, right? It's to show that she is a match to him. And Penelope, is arguably, you could make a good case that she is literally the single most famous fictional character in all of world, female character, in all of world literature, considering her longevity and fame, or most beloved. Um,
Yes.
And at the end of the Odyssey, Homer comes pretty close to like just straight up saying that Penelope is the true hero of the Odyssey. And there is a sense in which this is real, right? Like because it's Penelope who keeps Odysseus's home from being taken over by these suitors, who holds them off for 20 years while raising a son and keeps them all alive, right?
Mm.
Uh, Telemachus is still alive by the time she comes back. She's still alive by the time he comes back. The throne is unclaimed by the time he comes back. And all of that is due to Penelope, right? Which would be extraordinary. Like, it would be remarkable nowadays, considering the time period in which this took place. I think that Homer really does have a point. Like, this would be an extraordinary achievement for a woman to do, to hold off 108 men single handedly while raising a son, right?
Yep.
And she manages it for 20 years. Um, so, she is a singular woman. She's a match for Odysseus, right? That's the point of that scene. Um, and it's a very touching scene. And it's so disappointing to see them adapt it. And instead of Penelope, who's been waiting and waiting for 20 years for her husband to return, instead of her being grateful for him taking care of the fucking problem, uh, she is angry about it for literally no reason, right? Like,
Right.
why is she angry about it? I actually don't know. She goes, well, it's a slaughterhouse, like, I guess she just really hates wars, right? But, like, how are you expecting to solve this problem? It actually kind of hurts Penelope as a character as well, because frankly, it makes her seem kind of stupid. Like,
Yes.
you're not supposed to look at Penelope, you're supposed to think she's clever. You're not supposed to make her think she's short sighted. She has this opinion of what just happened and what happened with Odysseus, and the opinion is like, well, Odysseus is an idiot, I guess, or Penelope is an idiot, I guess, because she wanted Odysseus to return, but I guess she just wanted the suitors to like politely leave. One other thing too is that an interesting part of the story is that Odysseus himself, like I'm trying to think of how to put it. They don't just brush over the fact that Odysseus killed 108 men. The Odyssey is an intelligent story, right? That Odysseus killed 108 men is not a small thing. That's a lot of people who just died, and they all have families. Think of like the Red Wedding in Game of Thrones.
Yes.
The thing about the Odyssey, though, is that the Odyssey knows this. Odysseus immediately comes up with a plan to try and like buy time so that the word of the suitors killing won't spread. Then he gathers allies and he goes to meet them with an army. Like, he doesn't just kind of sit back and go, well, the problem is solved, right? Like, there's more to do. And more than that, it takes Athena's intervention to stop the battle. Like, they're literally about to fight, and Athena comes down and says, no, kiss and make up. And that's how the story ends. But, yeah, it's very weird, too, that in the return, when you have the opportunity to do this story, I understand that most adaptations end it just after the killing of the suitors. And I think that, to be clear, I don't really have a problem with that, right? Like, I think that that's fine. You don't need to know how he dealt with the aftermath. Like, we know there are ways he could have done it, any number of ways, right? But what's weird is that it does kind of treat it like in the return, like the problem is just solved. Like, Telemachus just goes to them, mother, father, I'm leaving. Like, wait a minute, your father has returned home for the first time in 20 years and you're going to go and find yourself? Like,
right.
You realize he's probably what? Odysseus is probably in his 40s, I would guess.
Probably 50s. Like early 50s.
40s or 50s.
Yeah.
If he left for Troy when he was around 20, he would be in his 40s.
Yeah.
So this would still make him pretty old for ancient Greece, right? Like, Telemachus, you kind of have to be around.
Right.
You know, it's weird. And it's also, there are other weird decisions in the movie. I didn't really like that they killed Laertes. Technically, Laertes is actually dead in Epic the Musical, but it is off screen and he doesn't appear in the story at all. I know the Ithaca Saga's not out, but I know this from leaks, and snippets that he's posted. Like, Laertes doesn't show up. He is in the return, and for some reason, he is alive when Odysseus shows up, but dies within a day before Odysseus meets him, which is just a really depressing choice, and I'm not sure why they did it. Like, I think the idea was that this is the thing that prompts Penelope to hold the challenge, the arrow shooting contest. But it's still kind of weird. Like, it just seemed like they were doing something really depressing for no reason. They just thought it would be artsy or something. Because sure. Laertes is alive at the end of the Odyssey.
Yes.
He, very much so. He even is like travels with them when they go out to meet the suitors' army at the end of the story. So Merg posts a comment. He says, I hear of returns, and I think that history has come back with a vengeance. I feel 20 years of political developments have been happening in the world in 2 months.
Of course.
Yes and no.
Something actually happened.
Yeah, so the thing about these sorts of feelings that people always claim to have, my thing about this sort of thing is that I feel like somebody says this once a year or so. You know what I mean?
Oh,
like,
I know what you mean.
It's always somebody going like, wow, I feel like, finally something is happening, and, for the first time, and then it's like, they say this every single year. And you go, meanwhile, things have been happening all along. So, here's the thing, though, that is different about this, which is that clearly the regime's plans have been foiled in this case. I understand that you'll always get people, and there are people out there who are like, no, Trump getting elected was exactly what they wanted all along, and you're falling for it. You've been duped. But, in my opinion, it's very obvious to me, mostly because of the assassination attempts, one of which came within inches of succeeding. Probably less than that, probably like centimeters, right? Yeah, it literally nicked him. One of which came within centimeters of succeeding. It is clear to me that the regime never intended for Trump to win, right? this was the deep state, whatever you want to call it, the empire that never ends, clown world. Trump winning was a major fly in the ointment. It was not supposed to happen, right? So when you look at things in that way, it does feel like perhaps we will be seeing something interesting happen soon,
Mm.
right? When Trump is elected, because suddenly the masters of the world are not getting their way in all things like they expect.
Yes,
Uh,
which is a good metaphor for the suitors.
it
Interacting
is
with,
actually.
because it's like up until Odysseus showed back up and started killing them all. And by the way, I never want to say murder when it comes to those suitors. It was just killing.
No, they were not murdered. They
They
were
were not
killed.
murdered.
It is agreed by all and sundry in the story, and I think was expected to be agreed upon by the readers that they deserve to die.
Yep. But like certain things, like how do I want to put it? Um, there's all kinds of black pilling and white pilling and black pilling and white pilling. And, like here's a black pill. The ISIS regime in Syria is definitely going to lead to a massacre of Christians. The white pill is that martyrs are taken care of, and their blood spilled cries out for justice. The black pill is that Israel is invading parts of what was once Syria, because Syria just kind of doesn't exist. Um, the white pill is quite frankly, it never seemed like Assad was a man who could handle power in the same way that like say Saddam Hussein could. Um, and he never really had control over Syria. He just ruled a coalition of generals who were the real power. Um, it's likely that he can go on and supposedly he's a Christian. Supposedly, I don't believe so, but they say he's of the Alawites. Maybe he can go on to lead a godly life, which is very important. Like he may have failed in one bit, but he can still serve the Lord if he is indeed a Christian. The white pill of Trump being elected is that Trump being elected. The black pill is that we're not going to get everything we want, and I'm okay with that because, quite frankly, what I want is impossible to get in any reasonable, realpolitik way without a dictator. But the white pill is that the pressure is going to be off our necks for 4 years, at least compared to what it once was. The black pill is that there's no one to replace Trump. The white pill is that there's a lot of political opportunity for those who have the ability to take politics, which neither me nor Anthony nor perhaps you, sir, can take. And it's like for these guys, the white pill is that Odysseus is back. The white pill is that the suitors are murdered. The black pill is that if the suitors were letting them get away with stuff, they're not going to get away with it anymore. Like in a quote unquote black pill, they're not Christians. They have a different thing. The black pill is that eventually Odysseus may be murdered by his son with I believe Circe or Calypso. Um,
Cersei, so the
Cersei.
one who kills Odysseus later.
Yeah, I think it's his
Yeah,
son
that's
by
in the
Cersei.
Telegony. So that's a story called the Telegony. It was lost. We only have like descriptions of it. It is
Mm,
also my understanding is that it is widely hated.
sure. I'm just saying that like if that's how he dies, that's kind of a black pill in the long term. The cycle of tragedy continues. Um, like we're not at an end state in history. Like even though there's a criticism that um, pagans and eternal history people have of Christians, and I think it's a little bit warranted, is that we have an end goal in mind. And I don't mean a criticism that's warranted in the sense of like we're wrong, more in the sense of yeah, it changes how we think, and it kind of hurts us in certain ways of realpolitik. That's my definition of a decent criticism in this scenario. So in other words, we're just waiting for Jesus to come back, and we're just living our lives, being good stewards of our lives. You know, we'll fail, we'll succeed, we'll fail, we'll succeed. But it doesn't, in a system that we have in a liberal democracy, republic, whatever you want to call it doesn't breed hyper ambition among Christian men. And even then, really a lot of the Christians weren't really ambitious. They were born into their high positions, like, St. Louis, King Louis the Ninth. Guess what? He was ambitious in the sense of crusades, and he was ambitious to his beliefs. But quite frankly, he was born into the role more than he fought and took the role. Does that make sense? Um,
Hmm.
so it's like there's certain things and dynamics that are really good for Christians. St. Louis took the idea that he was a steward of the French state and of the men and souls in there, and he ran with it. Even more villains of history like King Henry VIII had an idea of something like that, and it's a biblical idea. People forget that King Henry VIII was very popular among his populace. He was a young man. When he was a young man, he spent his time and talked to them. Spent the time of day with them, helped them out a bit. Like it bought a ton of goodwill that people enjoyed because, quite frankly, even though he was wasteful in the budgetary sense, the peasants don't care about the budget, and they never have. So there's ideas in Christendom that sort of hurt the naked will to power that pagans and Nietzscheans and others want men to have. Um, but also it's very much us also dealing with the times we're in, which sort of removes the ability for us to take ambitious leaps with what we have. We are stifled, quite frankly, at any and all opportunities, like I imagine Telemachus was among the 108 suitors. 108 pairs of eyes judging him and mocking him the entire time. The only reason they don't kill him like a lion kills the whelps of the lion, other lion that they ran off, is because Penelope is no lioness, though she is one in a metaphorical sense. She is no lioness that does not care whether her whelp lives or dies after a year. You know,
Hmm.
there's um, how's that for a Homeric metaphor? Penelope is not like a lioness who forgets her whelp 1 year after its murder when the new lion comes to visit her.
Yeah,
Uh,
it works. It's also of note there is actually a moment in the Odyssey, and this is actually in the Return, by the way. They include this bit.
mm,
Remember, I mentioned the Return. Telemachus leaves at one point and goes searching for news of Odysseus and learns about the island of Calypso, although it is portrayed as just, oh, Odysseus ran off with a woman. Uh,
yes.
so that this is actually in the Odyssey, Telemachus leaving and looking for news of Odysseus. Uh, we see it, and it actually there is a moment in the Odyssey where they end a chapter on a cliffhanger. Like we follow the story starts with us kind of following Telemachus, right? This
Mm-hmm.
is so notable that sometimes you see people call it the Telemachy, right? Uh, it follows Telemachus. He goes off. He meets with Nestor. Mentor helps him, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then when he's about to return, the suitors are there to ambush him. And then the book ends, and then we cut to Odysseus, right? And then we
Mm-hmm.
don't go back to Telemachus for like many, like 20 books later or something. 15 books later or so, right? So they actually do try and kill Telemachus at one point, but they do need to do it in a very particular way. Like you said, the difference is that it would very much affect Penelope, and while they aren't entirely interested in Penelope's feelings per se. I
Right.
mean, it is in their best interest ultimately for a while. And this is where the cleverness and the importance of Penelope kind of matters here, right? Like
Mm.
how Penelope is able to spin this. You know, um, keeping Penelope happy is in their best interest, right?
Yes.
Now, eventually, there is going to reach a point where it's no longer in their best interests. And that's why Penelope's delay needs to be done in a very clever way. And why she comes up with the idea of the loom, where she says she'll choose someone when she's done weaving the shroud, right?
Yep.
Uh, but she unthreads it at the end of each night because she needs to convince them that there really is an end coming, even if she doesn't really want there to be one, right?
Right.
Uh, and she does this successfully, barely, right? Like clearly, literally at the last possible second is when Odysseus shows up. But the point is that killing Telemachus could have had significant negative consequences and very little positive consequences for a long time. But now that Telemachus is older and can start asserting his rights as the prince, that balance shifted, and they actually do plan on killing Telemachus. But Telemachus manages to escape. He avoids the suitor's trap, and he finds Odysseus. But the point is that part of the fun, I guess you could say, of the Odyssey and the appeal of the end of the Odyssey, right, is that Odysseus quite literally arrives at the single last possible second,
Mm.
right? And they said this is in a number of ways. One of those ways is that if he had arrived any later, it is quite possible that Telemachus would have been ready to take over the throne, and Odysseus would have kind of been stepping in. As is, when Odysseus arrives, he is greater than Telemachus, but only barely greater, right? For example, there's the moment where Telemachus can actually string the bow. Right? And
Yes.
Odysseus needs to shake his head and tell him not to. But then Telemachus reveals to him that he messed up and accidentally left the storeroom with the weapons unlocked. Which, by the way, really big mistake, Telemachus. No, we all make mistakes, but you're gonna die. Uh, like, I understand everybody makes mistakes, but Telemachus, you're going to die. You've allowed them to get their weapons. They don't, though. Of course, they do not die. But
Yes.
nevertheless, the idea here is that while Telemachus is almost the equal of Odysseus, he is not quite. Also forgotten, canonically, Odysseus is cut. He is ripped as hell. Just an absolute unit of a man.
Yes.
There's no larger point here. I just find that very funny, and it doesn't really figure into a lot of people's mental models of Odysseus, I guess.
Right. But
Yeah,
it's
when you
like,
think of
no,
Odysseus,
he's a. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Keep going.
I don't know. It's just that when you think of Odysseus, you don't think, and also he is incredibly jacked. But that is canonically the case.
Yes. No.
I just find that amusing.
It's a thing of beauty. It's a thing of beauty.
Yeah. Even Homer spends much time lovingly describing how what a prime piece of manhood Odysseus is.
Okay, Anthony,
Multiple
calm down.
loving descriptions.
Calm down, Anthony. Calm down. We don't need to play
Anyway,
gay
let me
chicken on
read
a
some of my
recorded.
favorites I have
Yes. All right.
highlighted in the book. What?
Notated.
No.
Blown up into
Yeah,
posters.
with annotations.
Yes.
I fed them into an AI, and they came out with this image. What? Uh,
Just post them on a gym's wall.
I actually am now kind of curious about this. If I copied the descriptions of Odysseus from the Odyssey and fed them into an AI, can we actually get this is canonically what Odysseus in fact would have looked like? I'm gonna need to try that one day. All right. I'm done with my piece on the return. I would say again, the biggest problems with it are that it takes out the mythic and tries to substitute it with a modern sensibility towards war that does not fit in the world of the Odyssey and makes the characters and the story much less interesting and sympathetic, right?
Yep.
So I do not recommend it. It did have its good moments. The Argo scene was great. Uh, the swineherd was portrayed very well. The maid was portrayed very well,
Mm-hmm.
and it was well acted. Like you can't criticize the performances, I suppose. I even kind of liked the take that they had for Antinous. Uh,
Yeah.
so there you go.
Yeah. And it's Antinous is always portrayed as the chief suitor. It feels like um,
Yeah,
first to die. Uh, I remember in the Amanda Sante one, they have this great scene where not only do they kill him, because he's been a fairly major character, because they don't just, they actually like spread out the suitors a bit more in the movie one they did. Um,
hmm
and what am I trying to say? What they do is they actually like grab a spear and jam it into him so hard they raise him up the wall and pin him against it. And I don't know if
base.
that's fantastic. I can't yeah. Anyway, point is, and like the dude not just goes like ugh, he screams at the top of his voice. Like you can see he opens his mouth so wide that you can see the roof of his mouth. Like the dude just absolutely sells that he's being stabbed to death with a spear. Good on him. Um, you know what's funny? Is that my mom never really let us watch things like The Goonies or whatever, but she let us watch that Odyssey or like Kenneth Branagh's Hamlet and stuff like that. It's great. I love my mom. Just here, folks. Only the hottest takes. Only the most controversial possible takes here. But yeah, no, like some dudes being stabbed to death. Absolutely, we're fine with it. They deserve it. Weird.
Sadly, the best adaptation of the Odyssey on film remains "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou."
That's true. Except without, there could have been more murder. Um, no, not
It could have
really.
been.
There could have been. Uh, yeah. No, recently I've been doing a couple of YouTube short series on vengeance and adaptions and other things like that. And it's one of those things where Homer has plenty of time and does take care of the sympathies of the reader, like we are with Odysseus. At no point does Odysseus do anything to make people think, wow, such an asshole. I don't want this guy to succeed. And considering the amount of adventures he actually has a ton of opportunities to blunder it, and he just doesn't. In a
Yeah,
thousand.
it's very interesting
Mm,
because Jaji used to talk about this when we discussed it with her. She said that one of the things that appealed to her about the Odyssey was that, like, this is like almost hard for modern men to understand because he does do things that we as moderns would be horrified by, right?
mm-hmm.
But it is true. Like in the Odyssey, she's like, Odysseus doesn't actually do. She's like, yeah, I liked it because Odysseus doesn't actually do anything wrong.
Yeah.
Like she said this when I was telling her about Epic, and she said that she didn't really like the decision have Odysseus drop the baby off the wall in the first act. Then she got more on board when I explained that it came up again later.
Yeah.
And she's like, "Oh, well, that's actually good writing." But regardless, like her point was, well, when I read the Odyssey, like Odysseus was meant to be, completely heroic. He never actually does anything morally questionable, and it's weird because when you look at academic interpretations of it, nobody takes that view,
Right.
right? Like, and yeah, I think she's
No.
correct.
Nobody.
Like, that's
Nobody mainstream academic takes that view.
yeah,
Uh.
nobody mainstream academic takes that view. And yet, I think that's pretty clearly the point of the story. Like,
Mm-hmm.
Homer is presenting Odysseus as a culture hero, right?
Yeah.
Like, he is meant to be somebody who they could look up to, the man of twists and turns, who has a solution to every problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
Who can think his way out of every situation, even ones that kill everybody else, right? When other people abandon the gods, Odysseus doesn't, right? Even when starving, he has the willpower to avoid eating the cattle. against the Cyclops. He comes up with the plan for everyone to escape. He abides by the laws of hospitality when the Cyclops doesn't. And when he gets home, he rightfully takes his vengeance on the men who are abusing the hospitality of his kingdom, right? Uh,
Mm-hmm.
there is never a moment in the story where you're really supposed to look at Odysseus and go, oh, wow, he's really a morally gray character. I mean, he's not a morally gray character at all. Uh, like, he's actually quite morally upright. And
Yep.
the one moment that is really weird, but when you read the story, it's clear that Homer is not even really thinking of this, is the sack of Ismarus, right? Uh, so the sack of Ismarus happens at the beginning of the Odyssey. Odysseus and his men need food, so they sack Ismarus, they steal a bunch of food, they take a bunch of women, and they go back to the ship. This is presented in a very matter-of-fact way. In fact, it's actually intended to make Odysseus look good, because Odysseus specifically spares the priests of Apollo, who thank him for it, and give him the wine that he eventually uses to get past the Cyclops, right? The
Yeah.
enchanted wine. Um,
Do those women ever come up again?
no,
Yeah,
no. Presumably they're just killed. Uh,
Poseidon ruins them or something. Throws them into the
right.
water.
When during the storm after the
Yes.
windbag, the Lystragonians, when they crashed the ships,
Yes.
and they probably ate the food with the rest of the crew when they killed the cattle, the survivors, right?
Mm.
Uh, the point being that, like, all of this is to say that this was not presented in any way as a morally questionable decision,
Mm-hmm.
not at all,
Right.
right? Uh,
And from a non-Christian position, it's quite frankly not at all a problem. We, from God's perspective, have problems against, raiding and banditry and barbarian actions. But frankly, there is no argument outside of Christianity for not just murdering your fellow man for his stuff if he's, not kin.
right.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? Like Odysseus, this is what I mean by like I think that's the moment where moderns will go like, "Oh, Odysseus is actually presented in a morally gray way." When you go, "No, actually, if you read this section of the story, it's actually meant to make Odysseus look good." Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like when they sack that land and when they take their food and they kidnap the women, this is considered to be like right of conquest, right? They needed foods, they defeated the island, and then they took the trophies that were their due for winning their battle, right? Uh, there was nothing immoral about that, but Odysseus is careful to preserve the priests of the gods, right? And that's why you're
Mm-hmm.
supposed to go, oh, well, Odysseus is actually a good person,
Oh yeah.
right?
I mean, Agamemnon just wouldn't. He might go out of his way to murder them.
Yeah, fucking idiot. I am not an Agamemnon fan.
Why are you attacking the piece of Apollo? Because he made my men sick that one time because we were beefing with Achilles. So you're going after him again? Yeah, fuck that god. Piece of shit. Anyway,
Yeah, the point being that Odysseus is
Agamemnon's
presented
stupid. Oh yeah, yeah,
right.
yeah,
That too. But the point is fuck Agamemnon. All
yeah.
my
Yes.
homies hate Agamemnon. Uh, no. The point is that Odysseus is actually portrayed in the Odyssey as pretty much universally positive, right? Like he doesn't really do. But I am. All of this is to say that I am partial, though, to the interpretation, and I disagree with the rights on this. That Odysseus is lying,
Mm,
right? Like I do think that that's very plausible, and I don't think that Homer meant it to be entirely like unintended. Yeah, I
mm-hmm.
think that there is evidence at times that Odysseus is lying, but I think at the very least Odysseus is presenting himself as blameless,
Yes.
right? Which is important in this case. Like the way he describes Ismarus is it would have been something like right of conquest, right? Like,
Yes.
yeah, my men attacked the city. We raided it because we needed food, and then when we won, we took the trophies that is our due for winning the battle, right? They could have fought us. They failed, so we took what was our due. right? If somebody had brought up to him, but Odysseus, that's immoral, he would have been like, well, then why they should have stopped us. They didn't. I'm
Mm,
pretty like something along those lines. I think
yeah.
probably would have been Odysseus's response. Like he would have been kind of confused by the response, to be honest with you. Like the idea that it was immoral wouldn't have entered his head. But if somebody tried to push it with him, he would have said like, "Well, if they could have stopped us, then they would have stopped us, but they
Yep.
didn't. So we took what was our due." Right?
Athena shows up and warns me about this kind of thing all the time. She didn't. I assume I'm
Hmm.
in the right. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's also the fact that Ismarus probably sent men to Troy. So
Yes.
that's another reason that Odysseus feels like he has the right to attack them. They had just defeated Troy. And it is worth noting that in the fight against Troy, one of the more interesting things I read about like the Iliad, and I fully agree with this, by the way, I think this is actually an excellent take. As much as I find Hector to be an incredibly sympathetic character, even an awesome character, he's like one of
Mm-hmm.
my favorite characters in all of fiction. It is we must never forget that Hector is in the end the villain of the Iliad,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I don't think it's enough to say, oh no, he's really just the antagonist. No, I think that you do need to interpret it as he is genuinely the villain of
Yes.
the Iliad. Like he is the bad guy. And there are two reasons for this. The first one that's very important that people forget is that in the end, the Trojans are the ones in the wrong, in the way Homer tells the story, at least.
Yes.
Right? Uh,
They could have given
they
back
kidnapped, like
Helen at
they
any
stole
time.
Helen away.
Yeah.
What was that?
They could have given her back at any time.
Exactly. They stole Helen away. The Greeks were in their rights to go after her. Obviously, it got way more complicated than that, and you could argue, and as like Achilles kind of does, right, that they
Mm-hmm.
should have ended it sooner or whatever. But in the end, if you're going to look for a side that is to blame, it's not the Greeks, it's the Trojans. And Hector is on that side. The second big reason that I think it needs to be remembered that as great of a villain as he is, and as great of a character as he is ultimately still the villain, is that he is the one who keeps pushing to continue the fighting.
Mm-hmm.
Even in times where it would have been better for everyone involved not to, right?
Yes.
Somebody even mentions giving Helen back at one point, and it's Hector who steps in and says, basically, I refuse, right?
Right.
And to him, it's just like a matter of pride, but it's a matter of tragic pride, right? Like
Yes.
the right thing to do would have been to give Helen back. The thing that would have saved his people would have been to give Helen back. But Hector's pride was such that he couldn't do that, right? He would
Mm-hmm.
literally rather everyone die, right, than admit that this was wrong,
Yes.
essentially. So yeah,
And
that's one thing too. When you remember that Ismarus sent men to Troy, that's another reason I think that Odysseus would have been entirely he wouldn't have been at all bothered by the fact that they had to sack Ismarus.
yeah. And it's on a note on Hector, like I deeply enjoy Hector and his character a lot. I love his tombstone, the breaker of horses. I think that's metaphorically, something like young men. He broke young men who came up against him. Uh,
The
his
final line of the Iliad, in my opinion, is one of the great moving final lines in all of literature. I find it incredibly sad every time I read it.
yes. What is it?
And so the final line of the Iliad is, and so they buried Hector, breaker of horses.
Oh yes, yes. Breaker of
And I
horses.
love the moment. So it's such a beautiful moment to me because it's like, after all of this, it's like you could have said they buried Hector, king of Troy, right?
Yes.
They buried Hector, the great warrior. They buried Hector, you know, fighter of Achilles, but that's not who they buried, right? They
Mm-hmm.
buried Hector, the breaker of horses. And it's this moment where it's like, this is what we lost to the war, right?
Yes.
The war made us lose not the king, not the father, right? Like someone who, if we were at peace, he would have broken horses. You know, that's why it's such it's a beautifully tragic line.
Mm-hmm.
Uh Gets me every time I read it. Again, like this is one of the weird things where it's like I know it sounds odd, but there's a modern bias where it's like when I read the Iliad, and I was like, there is so much depth that I was not even kind of. I was
Yeah,
like, this is very arrogant, right? But
yeah,
like, I was not considering that it would have this level of depth and insight into human nature.
yeah,
I was wrong. But go ahead. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
yeah. But it's there's certain parts of the spirit that are good and worthy to emulate, but it's it's hard to sort of like live as we once did, like when there was a time when we could just have the nine worthies, Hector, Alexander, Caesar, um, Judas Maccabeus, Joshua, and David, and then Charlemagne, um, Arthur, and I forget the last of the Christian King three worthies. Um,
I don't remember.
yeah,
I'm not
Constantine,
even
I
gonna
think.
try.
I think it's Constantine. Uh, but
Who were the nine worthies? Let's see what Google says.
I think I got him right because it's three.
Joshua, King David, Judas Maccabeus.
Yeah.
So these are the ones you didn't get. Joshua, King
No, I
David,
did.
Judas Maccabeus. Did you get them?
Yeah.
I missed that. Oh, not what's his name? Charlemagne, you got right. King Arthur, you got right. Caesar, heck. However, Godfrey of Bouillon.
There we go. That's who I was missing.
I don't
Uh,
know a thing about this guy. I'm
King of
Googling him.
Jerusalem. During the Crusaders when they had a Crusader state.
Gotcha.
Uh,
Keep going.
yeah. So it's like we don't have a monoculture like we did before. And one of the struggles that we have, especially online, which as much as I enjoy shit posting, quite frankly, taking myself offline and not interacting with this stuff is that it's impossible to go through the weathers of what's this and what's that. Is it Christian nationalism now? No, it's actually in the downswing. We're dissident right. Oh no, we're actually Christian nationalists. It never actually went away. What do you mean it never went away? People just didn't talk about it for a year and a half, except for like occasionally when we like streamed about certain ideas. Like in our circles anyway, or if they were brought up, it was only in the basic ideas, and never seriously by anyone in my life. It's like, oh well, this is a thing now, and it's always been a thing. What do you mean it's always been a thing? Even though there's certainly a movement in a certain direction, there's no unified theme. Like when Sad Puppies was a thing, when the Superversive Press was a thing, pretty much immediately there were splinters off and fights over this and that, and part of it was I refused to back down to any of them, and maybe they were should have backed down in their own beliefs. People who were never Trumpers became Trumpers, and so on and so forth, which makes it feel useless, useless. Um, but it's like what are we to do? Where are we to go? But in reality, the solution I'm coming to is that in the end, you're not a philosopher and you're not a politician, and frankly, you're barely even a educated voter. Um, just you can't do anything about it. We're not in a point where society is degraded enough that manor buns form and we work together to defend each other and our land and people. We're not at the point where um, there's enough technology that it's like a cyberpunk dystopia where we can do what we want. Because there's a certain amount of power in being a techno barbarian. If you can have like a million low orbit ion cannon DDoSs and fire them off, it kind of gives you a certain parity. Uh, uh, with people who depend on that stuff. Like we're stuck in an awkward in between place without monoculture, without the ability to gather. You know, you scroll through Twitter and you see a post that it's like, somebody goes, well, I think reality is like this. Nothing ever happens. Well, then, something like Syria happens. That's actually something pretty big that's happening. And I know that in a in a hot minute, dispensationalists will be freaking out about the fact that Israel is expanding into a certain area that they supposedly have to own for the apocalypse to be closer than average to be happening. Um, it was close 1,000 years ago, guys. It didn't happen then during the Crusade states. Um, you know, it's it's hard to sort of even like put a firm footing on it. When Odysseus came back in to deal with the suitors, he was fairly confident, and at least I feel like he was fairly confident in what he had to do and who he had to deal with, and what the circumstances and situation was, and where his moral right was. It's his moral right was to defend his home and take vengeance on the suitors, who everyone agreed needed to die. But somebody needed to be bloody handed enough to do it. And maybe Telemachus could have done it if he had, been allowed to mature a bit. But, like I said, about lions and stuff like that, it's very clear that they were about to murder him. Sooner than later, damn whatever Penelope would have thought about it. So it's difficult for us in these modern times to see that sort of clearinghouse and wondering, what can we do with it and what can be done. Well, the answer is nothing. Uh, Odysseus killed the suitors. He didn't kill the obsequious bureaucrats and stewards and such that he had to keep in his house, to run his household goods and farms for him. He had to have had men like that. Well, guess what? They weren't exactly helping him fight, unless they did, and I'm slandering him for no reason. He kept the
No,
same.
they didn't.
Yeah, he kept the same people except for those women who slept with the men. Um, and he was right to kill them too, frankly. Uh, it's how do I want to like? There's certain things we want and expect that, quite frankly, just won't happen. You'd be shocked to find out how many times a dynasty would change in China, and the eunuchs would just be the same eunuchs from one dynasty to the next. Like it's that sort of thing. Um, what we want is not necessarily what we get, but quite frankly, most of the time anyway, we never really get we've never really gotten what we're asking for, a complete draining of the swamp, a suitor treatment to the whole thing rather than just to the suitors. Um, so, I say we should look to the return to understand the certain twists and turns of what the real politic is. In the end, there are people who are right to strike out against and to formulate plans against, because they are before God offending God and acting in a way that would destroy more lives. As all good Christians know, the death penalty is perfectly godly. When I look at things like, Arabian Nights in comparison, um, the people there, even the ones we're supposed to have sympathy for, are incredibly cruel. One story goes something like, I was beating my servant, and he decided he had enough of it, and unleashed a genie on me that turned me into this monster, or pillar, or whatever it was. He was beating a woman servant, and she was a witch, and stuff like that. And he has to be freed before she returns because she just rapes him every night. And it's like, we're supposed to feel sympathy for a dude who was beating a woman servant for no reason. Well, she wasn't as fast as she could have been. Her haughty looks I hated. No, this is stupid. Like, it starts off with the kings having to kill their wives because they cucked them, but then it's like, this dude was just beating a woman servant. Like, he deserved it, frankly. But he still played sympathetically, and he still played as the one who was wronged because it was his right to beat his servants. It's you know the cultural changes. At least we understand this culture, and we can sort of accept it. It's our duty to know the right from wrong in these situations. God doesn't call us to be stupid about these things, but rather, smart. I think a good reason why the Odyssey and the Iliad have survived to our modern day in such a strong way isn't just because they're some of the greatest stories ever told. It's because they have lessons that are needed to be learned or can't should be learned by those like us who have ears to listen. And it's pretty clear that acting in a manner that is godly and defending what's rightfully given to you is certainly a way to do that. Not that I'm calling for any particular violence or anything like that, merely the defense of one's life and loves, um, which is quite frankly soft in the eyes of many. Um, but I'll leave the forming of manor buns to the pagans and such. Um, Anthony, do you have anything else for us?
No, I said my piece. I'll also say, I guess, last thing is that I was pretty disappointed in,
Not worth the money.
yeah, in the return. It was. I had been looking forward to it because I saw two things that made me like. I will say it was cautious optimism because I don't trust anything from Hollywood implicitly anymore, or like
Mm-hmm.
from in the movies implicitly.
No one
But
should.
I was cautiously optimistic for two reasons. The trailer looked good.
Yes.
It is a cool trailer. And second, the reviews were calling it a faithful adaptation, but it was disappointing. Uh, Also goes to show you can't trust the reviews, which are positive. Reviews are not worth are not worth crap. They are useless. They are useful in trying to gather data about a film, I guess is what I would say. In
Mm-hmm.
this case, what got me is that they called it faithful, but it was faithful based on like the bare minimum of the events that happened technically sort of happened in the original poem. It was not faithful in terms of characterization or tone, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, do not recommend. I will, however, be watching the Nosferatu movie when it comes out. That looks cool.
Yep.
No.
Eggers is pretty good. Next week we should
Hmm.
have. Let me get his name real quick. Come on, baby. There it is. Isaac Young. Isaac Young.
Oh, nice.
Yep, he has a Kickstarter for his Domes of Calrithia, which he has been releasing over Substack. We'll be interviewing him about it and see how it goes. Uh, yeah, that's it. Thank you guys. Thank you for listening to Anthony's well informed and well structured rants and my more schizophrenic and unstructured rants. We appreciate you every week. Sorry for the audio problems. Hope you guys join us next week and have a wonderful week yourselves. God bless.